Hi, welcome back. I would like to talk to you about the development of the theater of the Greeks. Um, we have been really blessed to have several plays written in the ancient Greek by the ancient Greek playwrights. Very fortunate are we. Here is a picture of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. You can't see this very well, but it is Aeschylus. He was the first of all the playwrights in Greece, and then Sophocles came next, and Euripides. They were all about the same time, although Aeschylus was first, and he won many of the competitions at the festivals. And we'll talk about the festivals in a little bit. But there are two kinds of drama. There are tragedy and comedy, and we learn that from Shakespeare. And let's talk about tragedy for a minute. So tragedy really originated in these religious rites that that celebrated the life and the exploits of the god Dionysus. And there were annual festivals that were devoted to celebrating this god. And there were choral odes. Odes is another word for song, okay? So there were choral odes that were dedicated to Dionysus. And in the tragedy, the idea developed for drama, the idea developed from these choruses that were singing these odes, that one principal like the leader of the chorus would come out and sing a solo. And years later, another choral person would come out and interact with this first choral leader. So you'd have two people interacting, singing these odes. They were singing. They weren't actually speaking, but they were singing. And drama developed this way, so that you would have a chorus and you would have certain actors and actresses singing along in solos. And finally, much later we had people that were speaking, and then there would be chorus. So that's how the drama developed. So mostly poetry and plays originated in religion, and I'm going to talk about this in a different lecture. Hugh Nibley wrote an amazing article that talked about the mantics, the sophics, and the sophistic. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the religion and how that developed and how it actually was rejected later. But keep that in mind, that drama all originated in religion and religious rites. Now, as we go down, we are introduced to Aristophanes, who was a comedian, or he was a playwright that wrote mostly comedies. We will read some of his plays after we read the other three. And then we're going to also discuss some poetry, some lyric poetry by Sappho, Pindar, and some of the lesser known epics. Let's talk a little bit about architecture. Here's an amphitheater. An amphitheater is basically a staging area where, as you can see, all of these seats are filled with people, and here is what is called the orchestra. It's a staging area, and it's a circular, flat area. It's at the foot of all the seats where the actors and the musicians perform. And now an orchestra is just the pit where the musicians sit, hidden down underneath the stage, basically, and the actors are up on the stage. So that's kind of how the word orchestra came to us. This here is called a skene. Let me see if I can find, there it is, skene right here. And that became the scene, okay? So we get the word scene from the Greeks. And what's interesting is this word obscene means it's off stage or behind the scene. You've heard of the word obscene, and you kind of think of this negative idea that it's something that should not be seen at all because it is so awful and violent and immoral. Well, this word comes from the Greeks, and what it means is that here's the scene, the skene here. There's a lot of doors that take you behind the scenes. The people are watching action and the storyline, but anything that had to do with violence was done off stage, so that when people came to see the plays, they would not see anything that was violent. They would hear about the violence. They would hear about somebody killing somebody else, or they would hear about some drowning or some awful action, but they would never witness it. And this is why. This is very, very fascinating. If you think about an older lady who's being mugged on the street, and you're there watching it, your first inclination probably would be to go save that woman, right? Somehow get in there and help that woman and ward off this evil person, because that's our natural inclination, to help people, to love them and help them. Well, on stage, when you've come to watch this story, the Greeks felt like if people were to see the evil or the violence going on, that our natural inclination would be to run down and help them. But we know that this is just a story, and this is just pretend. And so we train our hearts and minds to not go and help. And the Greeks are saying that that's very immoral, to train ourselves to not be affected when somebody's killed or hurt or offended or any of those things. And so they felt that they needed to have every bit of violence, every bit of evil off stage, so that the people wouldn't have to train themselves to be okay about letting this violence happen. And that's where we get this idea of obscene. So anything that we shouldn't see should be off stage, right? How is that different in our day? Are we seeing more and more violence on TV, on movies? Are we seeing more and more of the actual graphic violence? And what is it doing to our minds and our hearts? Think about that for a little bit. Yeah, the Greeks said, I should not see any violence, or it will corrupt my soul if I see it and I can't help. So ponder that for a bit. Okay, the first Greek dramas were basically lengthy choral songs with a little bit of action. You can imagine a bunch of people standing in a row or in a choral area, singing the songs, singing the odes of what's going on. And then there was a tiny bit of action. In the early plays, you'd have one choral leader come forward and sing a solo, and then later you would have another many years later, you'd have another person that would interact, playing the parts of people singing one to another. Okay, and you saw this little bit of action, and the cultural difference with today is that in our movies or in our plays, there's a lot of action. You've got a lot of different actors and actresses playing different parts, lots of action, and there's not much choral. In fact, in most of our movies and most of our plays, there is no choral. We often have fun going to musicals where there's going to be action and chorus, and that's very similar to some of the later Greek plays. Now, choreography is a word that we get from the Greeks, and it just means choreo means dance, and graphy means writing. So basically, when you had people moving from one side to another on the orchestra or that flat area, the flat staging area, you would be choreography meant that there was dance and words or lyrics. Okay. Here is, let me make this a little bit bigger here. Here's a picture of the masks. Now the actors did not, most of them were, it was always men, okay? And they would put facial masks on because people were so far away that you couldn't really see the face. But they could see the mask because they're so dynamic. And so they used masks, and they wore long robes and things. Let's go down here. Okay, here is a little bit about how the music went. Let me move this up a little bit. So a strophe was when the group moved, when the choir or the chorus moved from right to left on the stage, and they would be singing. And then if they were moving from right to the left, whoops, that's messed up. Let's just change that. Left to the right. That was the antistrophe, okay? And the stasimon was when they were standing in place. And all of these made up an ode, which is actually a word for song. Let's make that smaller so it'll stay on the same place there. So, and then when there was a little bit of action, they called it epi. Okay, you've heard of the epic tales. We read Homer's Odysseus or Odyssey, the Odyssey. That's an epic, and it just meant a lot of action. So we've got epi, which was part of the ode. It was all the action that was happening. And so when you combine the epi and the ode, you have an episode, which really means it's the bit of action between the odes. So going down here, do you see this is where the people would sit? And this is called the acoustic center. What's fascinating about these amphitheaters is that they were built in such a way that you could hear, if you see this person right there, they could hear a man speaking all the words, and he could hear it clearly. He could hear perfectly well. And of course, when you fill all of these seats up with people, the acoustic is not as good, but it's still amazing. And so the technology was incredible, how they figured this out and how they were able to, do all their acting without any microphones like we use today. Okay, now here is a picture of probably modern people dressed up in ancient Greek costumes and masks, as you see. They all have masks and they're singing. Here's a choral piece with all of these men with their masks and a little bit of action going on. And I think that's the end. So when we look at the Greek theater, we think of, this is how all of our plays and all of our TV shows, everything that we see in acting, this is how it began. We owe a lot to these Greek playwrights. Aeschylus lived probably, I'm thinking 400 and something, maybe 480 BC. So we're looking at the time of probably Enos of the Book of Mormon, and amazing that this is our heritage. So as we go listening, as we go reading the Greek plays, think about this video and think about how they began to celebrate the religious rites. And also think about, what is it that I wanted you to think about as well? Look at my notes for a minute. Oh, think about the violence, that you will not see the violence happening in some of the first plays that we read, and how that affects you now as you're reading it and you're seeing that all of these bits and pieces of violence and evil are obscene. They're out of sight, and how that affects you to know that the Greeks really cared about our soul, and how it affects you now that we have plays and movies that let us see all the violence, and what does that do to us? So think about that as you read the plays and as you think about the inspiration that you are getting. And we'll see you next time.